Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her, low enough for the intern to hear but loud enough for Natalie to understand this was a declaration, not a description. She was standing 3 feet away, adjusting the infusion pump on a vancomycin drip, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory forged in places the hospital's credentialing office would never ask about. The dosage calculation on the screen was wrong. Not slightly off. Wrong. 800 milligrams when the colonel's renal function required 650. She'd already watched Pierce write it. Already watched him enter it into the system. And already, because Captain Natalie Hayes did not hesitate when lives hung in the balance, she'd caught his elbow as he turned away. 650, she said quietly. Not a question. Not a suggestion. A statement delivered at a conversational volume that somehow carried the weight of absolute certainty. The intern's eyes went wide. Pierce's face went white, then red, then white again as he realized he'd been corrected in front of a junior resident. The kind of humiliation that would metastasize into something darker. Something strategic. She already knew it. But she did not flinch. Did not apologize. Did not soften her voice with feminine deference or cushion the correction with reassurance that she was sure he'd simply been momentarily distracted. She reached over and changed the setting herself. The digital display clicked from 800 to 650, and then she stepped back and returned to her work as though the interaction was already finished, already forgotten, already beneath the notice of someone whose last assignment involved keeping a Delta Force colonel alive through a firefight in Baghdad where the rotor wash from the Black Hawk had felt like it might tear the flesh from her bones. Seattle General in Denver existed in a constant hum of fluorescent light and the metallic smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the copper undertone of blood and the sweetness of infected tissue beginning to turn septic. 8 months here. 8 months of moving through the ICU with a competence that made no noise, asked no questions, and demanded nothing except that the hospital's nurses and doctors do their jobs with the precision that kept people alive. The unit smelled like every hospital she'd ever worked in, the stale coffee from the break room mixing with the chemical burn of hand sanitizer and the particular mustiness of linens that had been washed 1,000 times and would be washed 1,000 times more. Her scrubs were navy, unmarked, the same as everyone else's. Her name badge was standard issue. The photo in her breast pocket, a folded flag from teammate Marcus, killed in Kandahar 3 years ago, belonged to everyone who'd ever lost someone on a dusty forward operating base and had learned to carry grief the way other people carried their driver's license. Room 347 held a patient who understood what she was. Not her name. Not her history. But what she was. Colonel James Everett Hayes, Delta Force, had taken traumatic brain injury from an IED that had detonated 6 blocks south of where Captain Natalie Hayes had carried him, 200 meters through hostile territory, his blood mixing with her sweat, his weight nearly pulling her spine out of alignment, to the extraction point where a Black Hawk waited with its side door open and its rotors churning the Baghdad air into something that tasted like fuel and dust and survival. The brain injury had stolen his memory of that day. Stolen his memory of the entire week. But something lived in his nervous system. Something that recognized her when she entered the room, that relaxed incrementally when she checked his pupils with her penlight, that became agitated and elevated his heart rate when anyone else approached with the kind of careless speed that marked them as people who had never learned that velocity could kill. She checked his vitals with methodical care, her hands moving through the sequence she could perform in darkness or in chaos or in any of the other conditions that her actual employers at the Department of Defense suspected Dr. Pierce might create. The vitals monitor showed steady rhythm, sinus tachycardia at 98 beats per minute, which was acceptable given the time of morning. His blood pressure was stable at 132/79. Oxygen saturation at 97% on 2 liters. She adjusted the nasal cannula, her fingers careful not to disturb the placement, and made a mental note of the slight elevation in his resting heart rate. Stress response. Something had changed. She didn't know what yet, but she would. Knowing things was not part of her job description, according to Seattle General. Knowing things was her entire job description, according to the encrypted phone number she'd memorized 8 months ago and had never written down. The colonel's left wrist had a tattoo, his own name, in block letters, the kind of self-identification soldiers got in case the body needed to be identified without dental records. She had identical coordinates tattooed on her right hip. Different name. Different unit. Same reason. Dr. Pierce watched her from the nurse's station, his jaw tight against his teeth, his eyes tracking her movements with the focus of someone calculating how to dismantle what he perceived as a threat. He was 47 years old, educated at an Ivy League medical school, the kind of doctor who'd built his authority on the premise that credentials created competence and competence created the right to be right. He had never been corrected in front of an intern. He had never had his judgment questioned by someone without letters after her name. He had never encountered someone who clearly did not care whether he felt diminished by her intervention. The way he said it to the resident, 8 months and she still thinks she runs the unit, was not an observation. It was a promise. Escalation was implicit in his tone, present in the way his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup, audible in the subtext of his voice like a distant siren that hadn't yet arrived but was definitely coming. Natalie moved through the ICU with a kind of efficiency that looked like nothing in particular, no wasted motion, no performance, no attempt to be seen or remembered. But Captain Natalie Hayes had been trained to move through hostile environments undetected, to shift her appearance in ways that made her blend into institutional backgrounds, to have conversations that left no impression. 8 months at Seattle General had required none of those skills. What it required was the ability to care for people without drawing attention, to be excellent without ambition, to correct a doctor's calculations without making him feel diminished, which was impossible, which was the point. Some men could not be diminished without experiencing it as a profound threat to their existence. Her left wrist ached. An old injury, something that had surfaced during an extraction gone wrong, something that would have ended a normal nursing career. But Captain Natalie Hayes was not a normal nurse. She had been trained to function with fractured radius, torn ligaments, and the particular exhaustion that came from keeping someone alive against the active resistance of every force in the universe that wanted them dead. The tremor appeared when she was tired. Right now, checking the colonel's full lines, her hands were steady as surgical laser equipment, each finger moving through its sequence without deviation, without hesitation, without any sign that the tremor existed at all. Pain was information. She registered the ache in her wrist the same way she registered the elevated heart rate in her patient, the tension in Dr. Pierce's shoulders across the room, the slight chemical smell indicating that someone had recently cleaned the floor with something stronger than the standard cleaner. Information was what kept you alive. She adjusted the drip rate on the saline, her fingers moving through the familiar sequence that had become automatic through years of repetition. Muscle memory was just another word for training that had been burned into neural pathways. The colonel's eyes tracked her movement. He was awake, partially, existing in that liminal space between sedation and consciousness where his body recognized safety but his mind couldn't quite locate why. She placed her hand on his shoulder, steady contact, the kind that communicated presence without requiring words, and his agitation decreased measurably. Heart rate dropped to 84. The monitor showed the shift immediately. Dr. Pierce watched from the nurse's station, his expression hardening into something that looked like hatred but was actually just fear. Fear of being irrelevant. Fear of being corrected. Fear of discovering that the system he'd built his entire identity around had cracks in it, and those cracks might have been there all along, and someone without his credentials might see them more clearly than he ever could. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she didn't care what he felt. The worst part was that Captain Natalie Hayes had spent 6 hours watching the colonel's oxygen levels stabilize in a Baghdad field hospital while mortar fire shook the walls, and she had spent countless other nights pulling people out of situations where feelings were a luxury that would get you killed. Dr. Pierce felt diminished. The colonel felt safe. Those were the only two outcomes that mattered, and one of them was substantially more important than the other. She finished her checks and moved toward the door, already thinking about the glucose levels in room 349, already calculating medication interactions for the post-op patient in room 351, already functioning at that level of simultaneous awareness that would have seemed impossible to anyone who'd never been trained for it. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. The heart monitors beat their steady rhythm. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept the classified parts of herself locked away, she was already aware that something was about to change. The heart monitors beat their steady rhythm. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept the classified parts of herself locked away, she was already aware that something was about to change. It started the next afternoon in the break room during shift change. Natalie had just poured coffee, black, no sugar, the kind that tasted like burnt rubber but kept her sharp through the 18-hour stretches, when Dr. Pierce walked in with 3 other physicians clustered around him like satellites drawn to a dying star. Chen, Rashid, and Kim. All senior attendings. All carrying the kind of institutional weight that crushed people like her for sport. Pierce's voice was casual, conversational, the tone of a man sharing gossip at a country club. "You know, I was reviewing some references this morning." Pulled Nurse Hayes' file from her previous hospital in Seattle. He didn't look at Natalie, which made it worse. Fascinating reading. Drug theft allegation. Never prosecuted, but that's usually how they handle it quietly, isn't it? Keep the PR nightmare contained. The room went dead silent. Natalie didn't look up from her coffee. She didn't flinch. She took a drink, the bitter liquid burning down her throat like liquid tar, and waited. This was the opening move. She'd seen it 1,000 times, watched officers use rumors like weapons, watched how a single planted seed could grow into something that strangled careers from the inside. Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. He stood, gathered his tablet, and left without a word. Rashid followed 30 seconds later. Kim lingered for exactly 5 heartbeats, then she too stood and walked toward the door. Pierce smiled, a thin, satisfied thing, and followed them out, his shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that sounded like applause. Natalie sat alone at a table built for 8. The coffee had gone cold in her hands. Someone had left a half-eaten salad on the counter, and the fluorescent lights hummed their artificial drone overhead. She set the mug down carefully, precisely, the way she'd learned to set down weapons in the dark. Control was everything. Control was survival. Pierce lingered in the doorway, turning back as if he'd forgotten something. "Don't take it personally, Nurse Hayes. People just prefer company they can trust." Then he was gone, leaving only the faint smell of his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like money trying to smell like authority. The next morning, a printed sheet appeared on the unit board at eye level. Formal performance right UP. Her name in bold. Insubordination and dangerous autonomy. 23 words that somehow contained an entire indictment. She read it once, committed every phrase to memory, and walked away without changing her expression. By noon, every staff member on rounds had seen it. By evening, the break room emptied when she sat down. Dr. Patel, who had laughed with her 3 days ago about a patient's terrible Netflix recommendations, suddenly found urgent business in the medication room. A resident named Torres, who'd asked her opinion on a difficult for insertion just last week, began scheduling breaks whenever Natalie clocked in. Someone removed her name from the staff birthday board with enough force to tear the paper. The message was crystalline, association with her was contagion. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Dr. Pierce came to the colonel's room while the patient's sister sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, reading something on her phone. Sarah. Marine Corps Major. Call sign Viper according to the encrypted dossier Natalie's handler had sent, not that anyone in this hospital knew that. Natalie was adjusting the 4 rate, her movements economical and precise, when Pierce's voice cut through the steady beep of monitors. "Nurse Hayes, a word." She straightened, turned. Kept her hands at her sides. Pierce's voice was controlled, clinical, the careful enunciation of a man performing surgery with words. "Your training, or lack thereof, makes you a liability to this patient. Dangerously undertrained." He turned toward Sarah, his expression radiating concern, the particular gravity of a physician bearing difficult truths. "Your brother deserves providers with actual credentials, not glorified pill counters playing doctor. I question whether she even understands the difference between confidence and competence." The silence stretched like taffy pulled too thin. Natalie could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath, the distant beep of another monitor down the hall, the soft rustle of Major Sarah's uniform jacket as she straightened in her chair. She stood absolutely still, her face a cold, flat mask. She let every word land. Let it settle into the corners of the room like dust that would never quite disappear. This was Pierce's strength, not loud rage, but precision. Calculated cruelty delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. When he finally finished, satisfied with his performance, Natalie spoke. For words. Her voice had dropped an octave, had lost the careful deference she'd been wearing like a borrowed coat. The dangerous part is that you actually believe you're the smartest person in this room. Pierce blinked. His mouth opened, closed. For exactly 1.3 seconds, she counted, the man looked confused, as if he'd been spoken to in a language he didn't understand. Then Natalie turned and walked past the colonel's bed. She didn't hurry. She didn't glance back. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd made peace with consequences, and the room seemed to shrink away from her as she passed. She didn't see the colonel's hand move, didn't see his scarred fingers reach out as if to touch the hem of her scrubs. Didn't see Major Sarah's eyes track her with the particular intensity of someone recognizing a caliber of training that wasn't taught in any civilian institution. But she saw the tattoo. Dark ink on tanned skin, faded now but unmistakable. A name. His name. And beneath it, a date. The 17th of March, 2008, Baghdad. Sadr City. The firefight that had lasted 57 minutes and ended with him bleeding out on cracked asphalt while mortar fire sang overhead, and she'd made a choice that had cost her 3 ribs and a lung that never quite inflated the same way again. She didn't stop walking. By week's end, Pierce had weaponized Seattle General's gossip network with surgical precision. The rumors had metastasized, drug theft, psychiatric instability, previous terminations glossed over and repackaged as facts. The nurse's station grew quiet when she approached, conversations dying mid-sentence like birds shot from the sky. Someone removed her birthday from the staff board, not a protest, just erasure. A small death of the ordinary kind. She documented everything. Every medication order, every physician interaction, every lab result anomaly that shouldn't exist but did. She photographed charts with a concealed device the size of a ballpoint pen, uploaded encrypted files to a server that didn't appear on any network diagram. She was a nurse on the surface, invisible to anyone looking directly at her, utterly competent and utterly unremarkable. Just a member of the nursing staff. Just someone the doctors could safely ignore. Late on a Thursday shift, she stood in the colonel's room reviewing his medication record when she noticed the discrepancy. A potassium order that didn't match the dosage documented in the chart. A timing gap of 47 minutes. A ventilator setting adjusted twice during Pierce's shift with no physician order to justify the changes. The pattern emerged slowly at first, then all at once, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Someone was trying to kill him. She felt the shift in air pressure before she heard footsteps. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the space like something with weight and mass. He smiled that particular smile. Still here, Nurse Hayes? Very dedicated. Some might say obsessively so. He leaned against the frame, completely relaxed, a predator that had never once been forced to run. Just finishing rounds, Natalie said. Her voice was steady. Her hands didn't shake, not from fear, but from the particular tension of someone holding back something vast and dangerous. That night, alone in her apartment in a building no one knew she lived in, she pulled up the encrypted connection and sent a priority message to her handler. Pattern suggests inside threat. Recommend immediate investigation. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, maintain cover. FBI en route. Do not compromise mission. The response came with the weight of a direct order from someone whose authority was absolute. She understood. The colonel was valuable. She was temporary. The mission was eternal. The next morning, Pierce called her to his office. The space smelled like leather and ambition, walls lined with diplomas from institutions that cost more than she'd earned in 5 years. He slid a folder across the desk, thick, official, damning. 20 pages of fabricated incidents. Twisted statements attributed to her that she'd never said. Manufactured complaints. The beginning of something constructed with the care of a man building the instrument of someone's destruction. I'm building a case, Nurse Hayes. And when I'm done, you'll never work in a hospital again. Natalie met his eyes with that same cold stare. You should hope that's all you're building. The threat sailed over his head completely. He didn't understand. He was looking at a nurse he could destroy with paperwork and institutional credibility. He couldn't see the captain underneath, the woman who'd been trained to move through systems and dismantle them from the inside, the operator who'd already documented every medication tampering, every procedural violation, every indication of a conspiracy that went deeper than his bruised ego and surgical pride. She stood, turned, and walked out of his office. Behind her, Pierce was already drafting his next memo. By the next morning, the memo was laminated and posted on the unit board beside the staff schedule. Pierce had used the hospital's official letterhead, printed in that authoritative blue and white that made every word feel like law. The title read, Incident Documentation, Scope of Practice Violation. Natalie's name appeared in the opening paragraph. The phrase insubordination and dangerous autonomy was underlined twice. Beneath it, a list of 7 bullet points, each one a careful distortion of that moment in the colonel's room when she'd corrected his calculation. A nurse walked past, read it, and deliberately looked away. Another stopped, squinted at the memo, then turned and walked the other direction. By noon, the entire ICU knew. By evening, the whole floor knew. The document didn't say she was dangerous, it simply implied it with clinical precision, the way Pierce excelled at everything except mercy. What she didn't know was that Pierce had already begun his actual strategy, the one that lived in spreadsheets and email chains rather than rumor. At 3 in the afternoon, he sent a memo to the hospital's Medical Executive Committee invoking Joint Commission Protocol 6.2.1. Any nursing intervention beyond standard scope of care requires dual physician approval and documented justification. Standard scope meant vital signs, basic wound care, medication administration with physician orders. Everything beyond that, protocol adjustments, medication timing changes, advocacy decisions, now required his signature and another doctor's. It wasn't a rule he'd created. Joint Commission had written it years ago, gathering dust in the policy manual. But Pierce had excavated it with surgical precision, dusted it off, and presented it as a safety measure that recent incidents had made necessary. He never mentioned her name. He didn't have to. The administrator, a woman named Dr. Brennan who'd been promoted into her position because she was good at meetings and risk management, received the memo at 3:06 p.m. on a Wednesday. She forwarded it to the nursing director at 4:02. By 4:15, new signage was being printed. By the next morning, the policy was live. Natalie read it on her phone during her commute through Denver traffic, rain sliding down her windshield like tears that belonged to someone else. She didn't miss a beat. She adjusted her approach. She documented everything. She learned the names of the physicians most likely to approve her requests, Dr. Chen, who was reasonable. Dr. Rashid, who trusted the nurses on her units. Dr. Kim, who had been a trauma nurse before medical school and remembered what protocol actually cost in real time. She began walking to their offices before her shifts, knowing which ones would sign without question, which ones might hesitate, which ones would require a 2-minute explanation of why the colonel's insulin dosage needed adjustment. It was a new game with the same rules: keep the patient alive, keep your identity hidden, don't let anyone see the cracks. But Pierce wasn't finished with documentation. He was building something architectural, layer upon layer, each piece designed to fit perfectly with every other. Over the course of 2 weeks, he compiled a file that would eventually run 23 pages. In it, he cited Joint Commission regulations, obscure ones about supervision ratios, about autonomous decision-making, about the precise boundary between advocacy and insubordination. He referenced the Texas Board of Nursing Scope of Practice document from 2019, a 40-page manual that Pierce had clearly read cover to cover looking for ammunition. He included the Colorado Board of Nursing's position on nurse standing orders. 3 different regulatory frameworks, all technically accurate, all twisted slightly to suggest that Natalie had been operating outside her authority since the day she'd corrected his dosage calculation. He was systematic about it. Professional. The kind of documentation that would make a hospital lawyer nervous and an administrator defenseless. He also began recruiting. Quietly. Carefully. At the physician's lounge on the 3rd floor, he'd mention her name in passing. Concerning pattern, he'd say to Dr. Chen over coffee. Multiple scope violations. I'm just watching closely. To Dr. Rashid, he sent an email, your signature has been requested on several nursing-led protocol changes in the ICU. Wanted to flag that they may exceed standard scope. To Dr. Kim, he was more direct, patient safety requires consistency in our approval process. I'm conducting a peer review. Each message was professionally worded. Each one was a seed. He wasn't threatening them. He was simply making them aware that if something went wrong, if the colonel's condition changed or declined in any way, Natalie's actions would be the first place to look. Then came the petition. Pierce scheduled a meeting with the Medical Executive Committee, a formal gathering of hospital department heads, chief physicians, and administrators. The stated purpose was standardizing nursing scope across departments. The actual purpose was to build an undeniable case. He brought signatures. 20 physicians in total. Not all of them had worked with Natalie. Some barely knew her name. But Pierce had approached each one strategically. To the older surgeons who believed nurses existed to follow orders, he presented the issue as a professional boundary problem. To the younger physicians who were more progressive, he framed it as patient safety. To Dr. Chen, he simply said, I need your support on a peer review process, and she'd signed reluctantly, trusting his judgment because he was senior staff and she was only 3 years out of residency. Dr. Rashid signed after he questioned her clinical judgment on a separate matter, the implication clear, cooperation on this petition would smooth things over. Dr. Kim signed because everyone else had, because it was easier than standing against the whole apparatus of institutional power. 20 names. 20 signatures. 20 physicians who barely knew Natalie Hayes but had become, in effect, her firing squad. The petition was printed on hospital letterhead. It read, We, the undersigned physicians at Seattle General Hospital, have reviewed the incident documentation filed by Dr. James Pierce regarding nursing staff member Natalie Hayes and are concerned about patterns consistent with dangerous autonomous decision-making that exceeds nursing scope of practice. We recommend formal investigation and disciplinary action. 20 signatures stacked beneath that statement like dominoes. The document was delivered to Dr. Brennan's office on a Friday afternoon. By Monday, it was in the formal investigation file. What Pierce couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that Natalie had been watching. Documenting. Reporting. Every medication order that didn't make clinical sense, every dosage adjustment that contradicted the colonel's existing prescriptions, every subtle escalation of sedation beyond what his condition required, she'd flagged it all in her classified intelligence reports. The patterns were becoming clear. Pierce wasn't just trying to destroy her career. He was slowly poisoning the colonel. The blood pressure creep. The increased sedation requirements despite stable consciousness. The delayed wound healing. The subtle infections that kept cropping up. It added up to something systematic. Something intentional. She documented it in language only her handlers would understand. Patient shows signs of targeted chemical adjustment inconsistent with medical protocol. Medications introduced by attending physician show poor clinical justification. Pattern suggests systematic degradation rather than standard care variance. Recommend immediate investigation of attending physician's medication orders. She sent it through the encrypted channel at midnight on a Tuesday, knowing that somewhere in the Pentagon, someone was reading her words and beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a nurse and a doctor anymore. This was about whether a Delta Force colonel, a man whose name was tattooed on her left arm beneath her scrubs, though brain injury had stolen his memory of the firefight in Baghdad where she'd carried him 3 blocks under mortar fire, would survive long enough for the truth to come out. The hospital itself had become a minefield. Pierce had restricted her access to the Colonel's care plan, reassigning certain monitoring duties to nurses he trusted. She could no longer adjust his pain medications without his sign-off. She could no longer order certain labs without a second physician's approval. She could no longer be alone with his chart. It was all technically about safety. It was all actually about control. But Natalie had been trained to operate in hostile environments. She'd moved through war zones with less resources. She began working around it, using the nurses who were still willing to listen, documenting her concerns through the official channels that Pierce couldn't monitor. She'd write her clinical observations and file them in the chart where anyone could read them, knowing that when the investigation came, and it would come, those observations would tell a different story than Pierce's narrative. One evening, standing at the medication cart while prepping the Colonel's evening fluids, she noticed something odd. A new medication in his profile, added by Pierce that afternoon. Vancomycin. At a dosage that made no sense for his current status. She held the vial up to the fluorescent light, reading the label twice. Then she walked to the computer and checked his recent culture results. Negative for bacterial infection. No clinical justification for antibiotics, let alone one this aggressive. She photographed the vial with her personal phone, a violation of protocol, but not the kind that mattered, and sent it through the encrypted channel, unjustified medication introduction. Dosage inconsistent with clinical presentation. Possible attempt at induced complications. Within the hour, she received a 2-word response, stay vigilant. It was all the confirmation she needed. They knew. They were watching. And when the time came, they would act. But that time wasn't now. Now, she had 20 physicians whose signatures were already on the petition. She had a hospital administrator who'd begun the formal investigation into her competence. She had restrictions on her access to the Colonel's care. She had a job that was quietly evaporating. And she had a 16-year-old son in Seattle who was about to find out that his mother's career was ending in disgrace. That night, her phone rang at 9:10. Liam's voice came through, small and uncertain. Mom? You sound different. Is everything okay? She looked at the folded flag on her apartment shelf, the one with Marcus's name on the ribbon. The one that never left her possession. Just a long shift, she said quietly. The lie was smooth. Professional. The kind of lie she'd been trained to tell. Everything is fine, honey. Everything is going to be fine. Everything is going to be fine. Those were the words Natalie had written in the Colonel's chart at 6:33 a.m., her handwriting precise and clinical, because in medicine fine meant something specific. It meant stable. It meant the vitals were holding. It meant the next shift would inherit a patient moving toward recovery, not toward a room that needed cleaning. By 7:14 a.m., fine was a lie. The Colonel's oxygen saturation alarm triggered first, a high-pitched beeping that cut through the ICU's ambient hum like a scalpel finding bone. Natalie was at the medication station restocking supplies when she heard it, her hands already moving before her brain caught up, years of training folding into muscle memory like origami. She was in his room in 7 seconds. The numbers on the monitor told the story before her eyes confirmed it. 02 sat dropping. 98, 94. 87, his lips held a blue tinge, the color of old bruises. His chest rose only on the left side, the right remaining absolutely still, the chest wall of a man who wasn't breathing anymore, who was suffocating from the inside while oxygen pumped into a lung that no longer expanded. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Air trapped in the pleural space compressing the heart and the working lung like a fist closing around a bird. She hit the code button with the heel of her hand, not a panic button, but a summons. The operator's voice crackled, code blue, ICU 347, respiratory distress. In the next room, nurses would stop their charting. In the hallway, someone would run toward the elevator to grab the crash cart. The machinery of hospital crisis would engage. But machinery takes time, and the Colonel had none. Natalie's hands were already moving. She knew this was sabotage, she documented it in encrypted reports 48 hours ago. The rib fracture flagged in radiology 3 days prior, the one Pierce had dismissed as insignificant, the one he'd deleted from the follow-up orders. The colonel had been walking, moving, turning in bed, and that missed fracture had splintered. A bone fragment had lacerated the pleura. Air had accumulated in the thoracic cavity. And Pierce had made certain no one was watching closely enough to catch it before it became fatal. The crash cart had the equipment she needed, the field expedient kit wrapped in paper the size of a playing card. She tore it open one-handed while her other hand located the anatomical landmarks by touch alone. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The thin space between ribs where a needle could access the pneumothorax without hitting the lung itself. This was a procedure outside her scope. This was why Pierce had documented her as dangerous. The 14-gauge catheter felt like nothing in her hand, lighter than a pen, smaller than a fingernail, but heavy with consequence. She found the space by muscle memory and anatomical precision, the same way she'd found it in a Baghdad alley when mortars were walking down the block and the colonel, then lieutenant, then just a man bleeding into the dust, had been suffocating from a sucking chest wound. She'd used a credit card and duct tape then. She had better options now. The needle went in. The skin gave way. The pleural membrane gave way. And then came the sound that meant she'd done it right, the hiss of pressurized air escaping, 30 seconds of audible pneumothorax depressurizing like an angry sigh, like the world's smallest hurricane venting into the room. O2 climbing. 67, 72. 81, 89. His chest was rising on both sides now, moving in sync like a bellows chamber rebalancing, like lungs remembering how to work. The color draining from his lips, the blue fading to pale to pink. His hands relaxing on the bed where they'd been clenched. His breathing slowing from the desperate gasping to something almost normal, almost human. 43 seconds total. That was how long she had bought him. The crash cart burst through the door at 45 seconds, the team moving like choreography, a nurses, respiratory therapist, the attending from trauma. They expected to find a patient in arrest. Instead they found a patient breathing, oxygenating, stabilizing, with a 14-gauge catheter properly positioned and a collapsed lung re-inflating. They expected to find a code. Instead they found Natalie stepping back, her hands empty, her composure intact. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, frozen at the threshold like a man who'd walked through a door expecting a room and found instead a cliff. His face was white the way a face gets white when bureaucracy crashes into biology and biology wins. His mouth opened. Closed. He stared at the catheter, at the patient breathing, at the oxygen saturation numbers that climbed steadily into the 90s like a plane taking off. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, someone with enough rank and enough experience to read a situation in half a second, looked at the setup, looked at Natalie, looked at the colonel's stabilizing vitals. Good placement, she said quietly. Who performed the decompression? Before Natalie could answer, before Chen could process the implications, Pierce's voice cut through the room like broken glass. That was outside the scope of nursing practice, he said. Each word landed hard, deliberate, the tone of a man who'd found his footing again, who'd remembered that documentation was a weapon that worked regardless of outcome. Immediate decompression without physician authorization. This needs to be formally reported. Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. She looked at Pierce, then at Natalie, then back at the colonel whose chest was rising and falling with the reliability of a metronome. You want to file a complaint because she saved his life. I want to file a complaint because she performed an invasive procedure outside her scope of practice, which is a direct violation of state nursing board regulations and hospital policy. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, and Natalie watched the ripples spread across the faces of the nurses who had stopped their work to stare. They had seen what happened. They knew what this was. And they also knew that in a hospital, documentation beat outcomes. Procedure beat results. A 20-page trail of regulatory violations beat a living, breathing patient. Pierce didn't smile. He didn't need to. He turned and walked toward his office with the purposeful stride of a man who had already won, because he wasn't measuring victory in the colonel's heartbeat. He was measuring it in compliance paperwork. By 7:13 a.m., the incident report was filed. By 9:15 a.m., Pierce had submitted it to the hospital administrator with a formal memo requesting investigation. By 4:16 p.m. the same day, the termination letter was printed and waiting in a manila folder on the administrator's desk. Natalie received the summons at 3:48 p.m., report to administration immediately. She sat across from the administrator, a man named Hargrove whose tie cost more than her monthly rent and whose hands trembled slightly as he held the papers that would end her employment. Behind him, framed on the wall, was a photo of him receiving some kind of hospital leadership award. A man who believed in systems. A man who believed that systems existed for protection. Dr. Pierce has documented serious concerns regarding your clinical judgment, Hargrove began, reading from the report like a eulogy. His requesting immediate termination based on scope violations and demonstrated disregard for hospital protocols. And frankly, given the extensiveness of his documentation, the hospital's legal team has advised that accepting his recommendation is our only option for risk mitigation. Natalie said nothing. The silence was a choice. The silence was discipline. We're terminating your employment effective immediately, Hargrove continued. The words came easier now, momentum carrying him forward like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. Security will escort you to your locker. You'll have 15 minutes to collect your personal items. Your badge will be deactivated. We'll process your final paycheck and benefits information through HR. She stood without waiting for dismissal. She walked out without arguing. To argue would be to start talking, and once she started talking, the words would need to include her actual name, her actual rank, her actual department, and that would explode the Dodd investigation that was now 48 hours from making arrests. The FBI had 16 more hours to gather the evidence they needed. 16 more hours to build the case that would destroy Pierce. She could give them those 16 hours. The locker room was empty. It was 4:15 p.m., late enough that the day shift was gone, early enough that the night shift hadn't arrived. Her locker contained the accumulation of 8 months of cover, a set of spare scrubs, a sweatshirt with the hospital logo, the cracked ceramic mug someone had given her at orientation that said nurses, the best people hands down. There was a dying succulent in the corner, brown at the edges, surviving on benign neglect. There was the photo of Marcus, her actual teammate, the one whose name was on the folded flag, the one whose hands had held the same weapon system she had, the one who'd taken shrapnel in Sanjin Valley that no body armor could stop. She packed it all into a cardboard box from the supply closet. Not her personal effects. Her cover. Her performance. 8 months of pretending to be someone who didn't exist anymore. The rain started as she walked through the main entrance, the kind of rain that looked personal, like the sky had decided to make a specific point. It soaked through her jacket, a civilian jacket, a nurse's jacket, not the Gore-Tex combat rain jacket that actually kept water out. She made it to the bus stop 3 blocks away before the cold really set in, standing under a shelter that offered mostly the illusion of protection. 20 doctors had signed a petition saying she was dangerous. None of them knew her name. None of them knew that she'd learned field medicine in a combat hospital in Kandahar. None of them knew that attention pneumothorax was just a basic emergency procedure, the kind of thing that came up when you were operating outside proper supply lines and the patient in front of you was running out of time. None of them knew that she could perform a cricothyrotomy, a finger thoracostomy, an emergency burr hole. None of them knew that the reason her hands didn't shake when she drove a needle into the colonel's chest was because her hands had been shaped by 8 years in places where shaking hands got people killed. She stood at the bus stop and held the cardboard box and watched the rain streak the window of the shelter. Water dripped from the edge of the roof in a steady rhythm, plink, 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 like a clock counting down to something. 16 hours. Then the phone would ring, or it wouldn't, but either way this was over. Either the FBI had what they needed or they didn't. Either the Pentagon was satisfied or they weren't. Either her 16-year-old son Liam understood why his mother had disappeared into this hospital for 8 months or he was about to find out in a way that would change everything. She shifted the cardboard box to her other hip and watched the rain fall. At 6:48 p.m., her secure phone vibrated once. A single message: proceed to hospital. Bring documentation. The rain kept falling. The next morning arrived with Liam carrying weight that had nothing to do with the shadow box balanced against his ribs. 16 years old, with his mother's eyes and a jawline that had only recently hardened into manhood, he pushed past the security desk at Seattle General like someone who'd been trained in the architecture of determination. The box itself was mahogany, museum quality, its glass face catching the fluorescent glare of the hospital corridor. Inside, medals caught the light like scattered coins, bronze catching gold catching silver, each one a story that had never been told aloud in his presence. "Mom's floor," he said to the guard, not a question. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already made peace with what he was about to do. Security waved him through. The colonel lay in his hospital bed with the pallor of sedation still clinging to his features, though consciousness had begun its slow creep back into the margins. Machines breathed for him in mechanical rhythms. Monitors traced the narrative of his vitals in glowing lines. And then Liam walked in, shadow box first, the way a soldier presents arms. The colonel's eyes opened. Not all the way, just enough. His pupils tracked movement. His hand, the one not threaded with 4 lines, twitched toward the boy, then stopped. Confusion flickered across his face like a candle struggling against wind. And then his lips moved. The word came in a rasp, barely louder than the ventilator's wheeze. Angel 6. Her call sign. Her operational designation. The name that had existed only in encrypted Pentagon files and classified briefings, whispered across 3 blocks of Baghdad under the percussion of small arms fire and the scream of diesel engines. The colonel's brain had been shattered in that firefight, the blast that nearly killed him, the impact that should have taken him but didn't, not when she was there. Memory loss had swallowed nearly everything. But somewhere in the neural wreckage, the body remembered what the mind had lost. The name had been tattooed on his arm before the memory came back. The name had anchored him to a ghost. Sarah stepped forward then, the colonel's sister, Marine Corps major with a bearing that made the room straighten without her saying anything. She was holding papers, official papers, the kind that came from Pentagon files and survived declassification hearings. Her voice was steady as a rifle barrel when she began to read. Captain Natalie Hayes, for conspicuous gallantry under fire in Baghdad, carrying a wounded field officer through 3 blocks of hostile territory under sustained small arms and indirect fire, demonstrating exceptional courage and disregard for personal safety. Each word landed like a salute. Each phrase was a detonation. Silver Star. For bravery that exceeded the standard expected of operational personnel. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. And then the doors opened. A 2-star general walked through like gravity had shifted. Full dress blues, ribbon stacked on his chest like a biography written in color, every movement carrying the weight of 40 years of command. He looked at the shadow box, at the medals, at the ribbons, at the physical proof of service that had lived in Natalie's closet for years, and he saluted. Fist to chest. The universal language of respect. Of recognition. An envelope followed. Pentagon courier, dark suit, the kind of anonymous federal presence that made bureaucrats nervous. He handed it to the hospital administrator directly, marked with a code name that had existed in exactly 3 secure databases. Angel 6. Dr. Pierce tried to interrupt. His voice cracked like old ice when he spoke, claiming it was a stunt, a fabrication, an elaborate deception meant to embarrass him professionally. He looked at the general, at the courier, at the papers in Sarah's hands, and his face had the appearance of someone watching the foundation of his entire world collapse in real time. Because he'd finally understood what everyone else had just realized, the woman he'd spent 6 weeks destroying hadn't been a nurse pushing past her credentials. She'd been a decorated military officer conducting a classified operation inside his hospital. And he'd tried to fire her. He'd weaponized 20 physicians to sign their names to a petition that was now, in retrospect, evidence of his own monumental stupidity. The general didn't respond to Pierce's objections. He simply looked at Natalie once, nodded with the kind of recognition that only exists between people who've served, and walked out the way he'd walked in, like the room had been a mission briefing and he had somewhere else to be. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Pierce. That afternoon, the parking garage. 2 FBI agents in charcoal suits, badges gleaming with that specific federal shine that made every physician's heart stutter. They'd been investigating him for weeks. Since the moment Natalie had flagged inconsistencies in the colonel's medication records, orders that didn't match his diagnosis, drugs that contradicted his drug allergies, a pattern of errors so consistent they could only be deliberate. The encrypted reports she'd sent to her Pentagon handlers had been forwarded to the FBI's counterintelligence division. Medical sabotage. Conspiracy to injure a federal asset. Possible foreign intelligence connections. They arrested him at 4:41 p.m., right between his car and the elevator. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Miranda rights echoed off the concrete like a benediction. Around him, 17 physicians who'd signed the petition watched from the pedestrian walkway above, their faces reflecting the particular horror of people who'd just realized they'd been used to execute someone else's vendetta. Dr. Chen. Dr. Rashid. Dr. Kim. The names didn't matter anymore because what mattered was that they'd chosen institutional self-preservation over professional integrity, and that choice was now a matter of federal record. When the FBI searched Pierce's office, they found files that told a story of meticulous corruption. Forged nursing complaints with Natalie's signature expertly copied on documents she'd never signed. Altered patient files, subtle changes that made her interventions appear reckless. Deleted radiology reports that would have contradicted his narrative. Encrypted communications with individuals listed in intelligence databases as foreign nationals with connections to hostile regimes. The motivation became clear: eliminate the colonel through a series of medical errors that would appear accidental. Make his death look like negligence. And remove the one person in the hospital who'd noticed the pattern. The woman who'd seen through 40 years of medical training and institutional authority to the criminal underneath. The federal charges carried a sentencing guideline of 7 to 10 years. Pierce got 7. The hospital administrator issued a formal written apology to Natalie Hayes. Her termination was expunged from personnel records. She was offered immediate reinstatement with back pay and a new title, Clinical Operations Specialist for the DoD, based at Seattle General, reporting directly to the Pentagon. But her cover was permanently compromised. The operation was concluded. The mission was complete. And her next assignment was already waiting in secure channels: another hospital, another identity, another classified objective. 2 years passed with the specific gravity of time that changes people in ways they don't immediately recognize. Dr. Pierce was released early, 5 years instead of 7, good behavior in a federal penitentiary in Oklahoma where he'd worked in the prison medical facility under strict supervision. But medical license revocation was permanent. The revocation was written into the sentencing terms and reinforced by every state medical board in the country. A convicted felon who'd attempted to murder a federal asset didn't get to practice medicine again. What he got was probation, restrictions, and work that most people wouldn't categorize as healthcare at all. Natalie watched through a clinic window on a Tuesday afternoon, watching Dr. Pierce load cardboard boxes into the back of a white medical supply van. His movements had changed. The arrogance had been completely metabolized by confinement. His shoulders hunched like someone carrying invisible weight. The van belonged to a rural dialysis company that accepted employees with criminal records because staffing was difficult in the mountains and the pay was low enough to justify taking risks. He loaded oxygen tanks. He restocked for supplies. He delivered equipment to rural clinics where the nearest cardiologist was 90 minutes away. This was healthcare work now, the only kind his probation terms allowed. Delivery. Supply. The absence of authority. Inside the clinic, behind the window where Natalie stood, the colonel was adjusting to consciousness that had finally, fully returned. The experimental treatment at Walter Reed had worked. Neural plasticity, medication adjustments, cognitive rehabilitation conducted by specialists with access to classified protocols, the memory had come back. He was awake. He was coherent. He was alive in a way that seemed impossible after the blast, after the medic who dragged him through 3 blocks of Baghdad under fire, after everything should have ended in a body bag. Natalie adjusted his for a fluid bolus, running slightly fast, perfectly measured, and he reached up with his non-dominant hand and touched the scar on his left chest where the needle decompression had left its mark. The scar was thin, barely visible, the way scars become when enough time passes and healing is complete. "I always knew your name was there for a reason," he said. His voice was clearer now. Stronger. The rasp had faded. The body remembers what the brain forgets. She didn't answer him with words. She just held his hand for a moment, not touching, but present, and then she was gone, moving to the next patient because a clinic full of people needed medical attention and the work had never stopped, would never stop, had simply shifted shape like water finding a new channel. Sarah visited every week. The Colonel's sister had retired from active duty to work veteran advocacy, and she carried Natalie's medals in that mahogany box like they were sacred objects requiring protection. Liam was at Georgetown Pre-Med, the shadow box sitting in his dorm room, his understanding of his mother's service growing larger with each passing semester. The 20 physicians who'd signed Pierce's petition had each received formal reprimands in their personnel files, not career-ending for most of them, but permanent. Dr. Chen transferred to another hospital in California, unable to face Natalie in the corridors of Seattle General. Dr. Rashid had stayed and now taught ethics seminars about groupthink and institutional courage. Natalie accepted a new position training DOD medical personnel in operational medicine. Teaching others how to hide in plain sight. How to maintain cover under pressure. How to recognize that credentials matter less than character, that the quietest person in a room might be the only one who actually sees the truth. This was the thing that nobody talked about, the part that didn't fit into medals or ceremonies or the official narratives. This was the cost that lived in the space between who you were and who you had to pretend to be. This was the weight of secrets that you carried alone while everyone around you assumed you were simply what you appeared to be. The clinic closed for the day at 5:56 p.m. Natalie gathered her things, her badge, her phone, Marcus's folded flag from the shelf where it had lived since the day it arrived at her door with a letter explaining that sometimes the body comes home but the spirit doesn't. She walked to her car carrying that flag and a new photograph, one taken at a Pentagon ceremony 6 months ago. The Colonel in dress uniform, standing beside her in dress uniform, both of them alive when statistics and blast patterns suggested they should be dead. Subscribe to Code Whisperers for more stories about the people hidden in plain sight, the ones who carry secrets and save lives in the dark. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who they were actually standing next to. And comment, have you ever judged someone based on what they appeared to be, only to discover you were completely wrong?